Hey guys, my name is Anthony Kearle. I'm a fantasy author and world builder with a severe addiction to caffeine. I'm the author of the An Echo of the Ashes trilogy, which contains Book 1, Blood of the Eagle, which was released last year, 2022. Book 2, Shadow of the Nightingale, which is slated for publication this November. And Book 3, which I've completed and I'm hopeful for a 2024 release, and this is known as Song of the Raven. As I've reached my 6th year as a writer, a time which has included the completion of 4 novels set in the same world, and I'm currently working on the 5th. I really wanted to do a Q&A kind of thing on social media, and I got quite a few interesting questions, and something I've been thinking about for a while was starting a YouTube and just to work on some more like video editing things and stuff to do with the books, my world, everything like that. And I thought that maybe a good introduction could be me giving some in-depth responses to these questions. So yeah, that's why I thought I'd start this YouTube channel so that we can discuss things. So with the Q&A, the things were regarding fantasy, books, world building in general, etc. Just things along that line. And yeah, I just wanted to answer the questions and give everyone some more time, some in-depth responses, and see how things go. So here we go. So the first question, how long does it take to create an entire fantasy world? And do you have any tips for new fantasy authors that are just getting started? So with my world, I started in late 2017, so I was just finishing up my 3rd year of uni where I studied 2 degrees in graphic design. And during my time at university, I started getting a bit more interested in writing, especially fantasy writing. I'd always loved the journey of fantasy, coming from a house of readers and being introduced to fantasy from a very young age. Like, some of my earliest memories include my mum reading us Harry Potter, or myself reading Deltora Quest, Rowan of Rin, moving into Ranger's Apprentice, Lord of the Rings, etc. So that sort of was where my sort of taste really sort of started to develop, my passion for fantasy, I should say. And so yeah, in 2017, I'm not sure what it was, but I just felt like doing a bit of writing. So I ended up writing this small passage, it might have been 1,000 words or 1,500 words maximum, about this character called Katara, who has become one of the main protagonists in my books. So she's this warrior who was placed into in the scene, and captures her in this fighting cage where only 2 go in, they're armed with swords, and only 1 comes out. And so I read this scene, and as I was writing it, originally she came out as she was half elven. That part is long gone since I started writing the books, but she was half elven. She was put into this crowd of humans. So why was she there? She was in this country that was called Mirror, this kingdom of Mirror, where they're savage. All the men are warriors. So it's more of like almost like a Spartan society. And yeah, there's this woman, this young girl of mid-20s, who's thrust into this fighting cage where only the strong survive, only 1 walks out. So why was she there? Why was she put into this foreign culture? Because I mentioned time and time again in this passage that she wasn't from there. She'd grown up with pirates along the way, where she'd grown up in the sewers of another country, so she'd travelled 3, 4, 5 times to reach this place, and it ended up with these warriors who disliked foreigners. And yet she's not just a foreigner, she's half elven, who distrusted by both elves and humans. So how did she get there? She's got a scar across an eye, she's got this green sash around her waist from her time as a pirate. So the world started to develop from there, and things started progressing. So I ended up creating a map of Mirror. I started with Mirror, at least, I should say, and then my imagination progressed. I started creating the different lands, the map spread, borders developed between different countries, and from there I really wanted to know more about Katara. I wanted to know more how she'd got to where she was, her past, why was she there. I wanted to know more about the Mirrans and this sort of Spartan society, which slowly started to turn more and more into the cavalry and horsemanship based society where gold has no value, they trade with each other. Yet why do they hate foreigners? Okay, so I started to delve more and more into these small little things like the government, the politics, did they have a religion, kind of things like that. And from there it grew. I wanted to develop more different cultures around them. So Anora came, so that's a bordering country. Selvar, this savage land of barbarians. Were they actually barbarians, or was that just the perception of the Mirrans? What was Medea? Where did Medea come from? Larissa, the Circassian Sea, the Valkyr Isles. All these different nations started appearing. They had different governments, different religions, different cultures, different names, different histories. Like, when I really started world building, one thing that I really wanted to do is make this world as realistic and like just as grounded and real as possible, and to make it rich, filled with life. So even nations have got opposing views on same events that have happened. I wanted to craft this world that was very much like person driven. Not there's no like great quest. There's no good and bad. There's morally grey, and you could support anyone or any country based on your own point of view. Like, there was no bad option, and that's sort of how I really wanted to build this world. So yeah, I started building. I started doing a lot of research. I spent probably 8 to 10 months, probably close to 10 months after I'd written this one scene, purely focused on world building and expanding these cultures. Who were the Larissans? Why the nomadic desert tribes to the south, yet the north is incredibly rich and is more of like a kingdom led by Queen Rashada. A sole ruler. Why is she there? Why is this happening? What is the Great Aurarian Empire, whose symbol is the griffin? Where did they come from? What is their history? Which nations are at war? Which nations have made peace? Why did they fight to begin with? Do they still hold grudges? So many different things I wanted to go into and flesh it out. Like, it just made sense to me that not only did the characters and their bloodlines have history, but these different cultures as well. How did they intermingle, entwine, things like that. So yeah, I made 6 or 7 journals just filled with. I had direct quotes in there that I've moved into the book. I had rough ideas for characters, for how to name people in different regions, things like that. As this map developed, I started to research like how long would it take to go on foot from A to B, or how long would it take on horseback or by ship if there was like a river or an ocean. Because this is vast. Mira itself is nearly 500 miles, and it's barren plains for the most part, so of course they'd logically use horses as transport and focus on this sort of horsemanship culture that they've got. Like, it's everyone in their culture, they're the best horsemen in the world because of where they grew up. They're incredibly hardy, incredibly tough and strong people. Okay, how did this happen? Of course they're going to have a different government to as a group which has grown up with less resources and who've been invaded many times. Of course they're going to have a very different governing body and different culture to someone who've been at peace for the last 500 years, for example. So my research, that was the books, documentaries, I'd hear bits and pieces, so I'd research deeply onto small things, even just on the internet, whether anything from medieval combat, like HEMA, for example, to strategy in combat, warfare, boat travel, fairy tales of different cultures, mythology, big events, people such as the Poison King, things like that. So these odd little stories that I just loved, and how every different culture in our own world has got different mythologies and not necessarily even just religions, but different histories, and how they ended up how they are now. Like, this was very interesting to me, and that's the sort of world I wanted to build, so that was real and make everyone different. Different armor, different weaponry, different names, architecture, economics, governments. So for example, with naming things, so obviously in our own world, different countries have different names. So it made sense to do the same. So say, for example, different regions have different names. So Anora, for example, they use Y and E in a lot of names. They use a lot of Ks, a lot of Ys. They don't use Cs at all. C is a foreign letter to Anora. So names such as Dane and Galadane, very similar. But that's just how I wanted to build it, because people will have very similar names in real life, or even you'll walk down the street, you'll meet someone with the same name as you. So it felt normal to do the same sort of thing regarding that. So Mira, they have very angelic names. So there's these savage horsemen, and yet they've got names like Xavian, Zandir, Ulrich, things like that, Azrael. Yet they're these supposedly bloodthirsty horsemen. So it was interesting to sort of delve into that. Mira itself, their actual names, they use a lot of I's instead of E's. Different cultures have different pronunciations. So say Anora, they've got one of their former kingdoms inside of Anora is called Leoflade. So A-E is pronounced like A, Leoflade. Yet A-E in Selva is pronounced like you would say air almost, so it's like air. So one of the main tribes is called the Erde. And that's sort of how I wanted to do it. So different cultures would have different pronunciations to similar spelling variants, things like that. So with my hundreds of years of culture and histories, there'd be these big cataclysmic events that have happened, they might have forced borders to happen. They might have forced generational anonymity between different cultures. So one of the big pivotal points happened actually 100 years before when my story takes place, called the Inquisition, which happened in, what is now known as Medea, but was previously just called the Northlands, which was broken up into dozens and dozens and dozens of fiefdoms led by barons, and yet now Medea is led by 5 dukes and there's 5 provinces. And there's this big tension between their bordering of Selva, which is this giant woodland forest where 12 tribes reside in. And they were essentially, this big event forced them apart. And that hatred still lingers 100 years later because of it. So see, these events like that, so that I really wanted to delve into and really blow up, make rich, and add the history to these cultures. Before I even started writing, I really wanted these histories. So did they take different aspects of cultures from one another? Yeah, absolutely they would. If you're bordering, so even look at our own world, look how similar, especially early Rome was to early Greece. Look at their gods, like Zeus to Jupiter, like they've got the same pantheon, for the big ones at least, like in the religion. So why would this world not have similar things? So, or different aspects of things, like they might have learned. So say for example, there was a former empire in our world which completely obliterated, and the language doesn't even exist anymore. It was completely wiped out, called Delios. They had an empire, and they one of the main places they conquered was Aurea, which was it was a big country at the time, but it wasn't this superpower that it's become. And the Nicholas Gedalia, who was the conqueror, who was the Dalian king at the time, he had 8 children, 7 sons, 1 daughter, and he didn't name an heir when he died, and he was killed. He was assassinated by Aurea because they conquered that, enslaved the Aureans. They'd been generationally enslaved. Aurea rose up as the children of Gedalia started fighting amongst each other for control, and Aurea ended up obliterating them. They rose up in rebellion and won. And they initially started just with the enslaving of the surviving Dalians, but that grew, and it became a big part of their culture, slavery. Looking at religions, for example, say between the core religion to a lot of the southern countries, so you look at the Aurean Empire, you look at Anora and Medea, to name a few, their main religion is based on, it's called the Twins, but there's 3 gods. So the Twins is Durandal, who's the warrior god of the sun, and Azaria, who is the goddess of wisdom and the moon, and the 3rd god is called the Pale Horseman, who is the god of death. And then you move, they're the only 3 gods that this religion has. You move to Selva, they have a whole pantheon of gods, but they've got their big 3, their main 3, which is Yorath, the warrior god of the sun, you've got Sylvain, the goddess of the moon, and you've got Tanrus, the god of death. And they're all very similar, they have the same symbols, the same attributes. Are they related? Who knows? Maybe that's a little thing I'll bring into later books. Maybe I've already written it. We'll see. But things like that really interested me in that, how could cultures that are so different have such like big similarities as well, yet in some ways hate each other? Like with how governments came into place, this warrior culture, this warrior horseman culture, only became a kingdom after they were conquered by Idrisir, and then they rebelled and cast them out. Thanks to a guy named Xavier, the first ever king of Mira. He's known as the Phoenix. His symbol was a phoenix. Medea became Medea after the Inquisition that took place 100 years before. Like, it's things like that. And then what's really developed in my story is that you never know how lines will affect the core plot. There's a throwaway line in book 1, which I will reveal when it becomes very important in a couple of years. But this throwaway line ended up becoming an integral core plot, not just for this trilogy, but for the prequel and the sequels I'm currently writing as well. So, things like that, you never know how lines will be used and how the world will develop. Like, I'm currently over 800,000 words into this world between my books, and I'm still world building. Like, I did my core 10 months to a year of world building, and yet even all these years later, nearly 6 years later, I'm still building it. And that to me is really interesting because there's so much history you can explore in our own world, and that's how I want it in this world that I've created. It's so richly developed, and so the biggest, I should say, like, how long does it take to start a fantasy world, to create an entire fantasy world, is that it just keeps happening after you've gotten started. Like, yeah, for me, that's just what it's like. Question 2. Can you recommend any books that you've read to gain inspiration from the historical element? You've obviously studied various histories and weaponry, and I was wondering if you had any good books to mention. Yeah, absolutely. So I've got plenty of them at home. You might be able to see some behind me. So some of the ones that I really, really got a lot out of are Battle by R.G. Grant, Weapon by DK, which actually really helped me with creating different weapons or like inspiring them. Say, for example, Katara's sword, the Tao, comes straight from that book. Another one, Battles That Changed History by Amber Books, and Fighting Techniques of Naval Warfare from 1190 BC to present. So those were my main sort of warfare and combat books, but I did a lot of research on, if I was interested in particular battles or figures, I'd do a lot more research on the web. Like, I might start with books, but I might want to pinpoint certain things that I'd read about, so I'd go from book usually to web, or vice versa. For mythology and folklore, I found this really good series called The Enchanted World by Time Life Books, and it's about all different mythologies. Like each book sort of targets a different thing, whether it's giants or dragons or wizards and witches, things like that. And it goes into a lot of depth with those. And I love that because at the time I was really working on my folklore for my books. Celtic mythology by Arthur Cottrell is really, really good, and Greek mythology as well is another really good one. But as I said before, I did research into Slavic mythology and other stuff too. Those were probably my top 3, I would say, and some others that I found really, really helpful. So, The Dictionary of Heraldry by Joseph Foster, Daily Life in the Age of Chivalry by Reader's Digest, The Life and Campaigns of the Black Prince by Richard Barber, The Gallic War by Julius Caesar, so that's his own journals that have been translated, and The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli. So those are sort of like a lot of the core elements, but where I live, it's hard to find particular books on certain elements, so a lot of my time was spent online. I like to read stuff from the era, whether or not it's particularly whether it's written as a history or not. So, say for example, the Iliad and the Odyssey, I think those add a lot of authenticity to what you're doing. Is if you can sort of gauge the vibe of that era, it can really help you create it. But I would say a lot of my time was spent with documentaries as well. My favourite being Britain's Bloody Crown by historian Dan Jones. So that is about the War of the Roses.
The Wars of the Roses are started not by hatred, but from a noble desire to do the right thing, in which the real villain isn't scheming Yorkists or belligerent Lancastrians, but a man so feeble-minded and vacuous he allows a wound to open in his country that takes half a century to heal. He is Henry VI, the Mad King.
Which was a 30-year civil war between the House of York and the House of Lancaster, during which the crown changed hands 7 times. So one of the houses, it's known as the War of the Roses because one of the houses, their symbol was a white rose and the other one was a red rose, which is, for me, that's actually a pretty funny bit of family history on my grandparents' side, is that one of my grandparents comes from the red rose, one comes from the white rose, so it's a bit of fun, and another channel I'll highly recommend is Invicta. So it's particularly for ancient history if you're interested in. So Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, ancient Rome, the fashion of kings in medieval times, and there's so much more that is on that. Like, you can spend hours because it'll focus on events, it'll focus on exact battles and how they took place with historians' point of views or people who might have been there, like Suetonius and things like that. So it's so interesting to me just to sort of get an understanding of these times, these people, these places, these cultures, like even what their clothing they wore. Did they have pets? Things like that, you know? There's interesting little bits, little niche things that you can add in there. They might not be, you might not feel like they're much, but they can really add a lot of depth to your writing. But yeah, as I said before, a lot of research was web-based. Because, yeah, I've got a lot of books here, but if you can't find exactly what you're looking for, or you might stumble, as I said, like onto the Invicta channel, you might be looking for Alexander the Great, but then you've watched all the stuff on him, and suddenly you're watching stuff about Julius Caesar, and you've learned new bits and pieces to add. So I like things like that, stumbling on things. And one of my favourites was the documentary on the Poison King, the King of Pontus. So Mithridates, his name was. The next question: where does inspiration come from? Real world, which you then turn into fiction, or just dream up and expand it upon? So for me, I would say both. I wanted my world to feel as real as possible, as I said, so I wanted every action to feel logical and that it could happen if a person was in that situation. So regardless that it's fantasy, regardless of what's there, whether, say for example, there was a dragon or something like that, I wanted the reactions to feel realistic at that time. I wanted the characters to feel morally grey, so there was no perfection. Not one character is purely good or bad. There's a lot of grey, depending on your own point of view. It's a very character-driven and motivated book, my series. And that gives them room to make mistakes and to grow. Growth doesn't necessarily mean good, right? You can have villain arcs in that time. I want a world rich in history that felt alive, and that was sort of the base idea that it came from. I mean, obviously there's going to be real-world inspiration. So say, for example, look at Game of Thrones. You take away the dragons, you take away the magic, and it's got a lot of similarities to War of the Roses. A lot of what I did, I suppose, comes down to what I like to see in fantasy. I'm a very visual writer, and if I can't see it, then I can't write it. So since my story is heavily character-driven, as the characters grow, the story grows, and that's sort of how it all expands, I would say. So a lot of it's, yeah, it's in my head, but of course there's going to be real-world inspirations. Do you have any plans to use some AI tools out there, such as image generation? It would be amazing to see some artwork of how you imagine the people and places. So, not currently, not with AI at least, but some art would be amazing. I'd probably go a more traditional route of looking for like a visual artist or something, which I'm starting to sort of float into. I did some sketches in my early day, like my original map, but shout out to Charles Thompson from Whitehawk Creek Forge in Tasmania, who really helped change the map. Like, I did the original, and then he really brought it to life. He went over and above. So massive shout out to him. But no, I know how all the characters and that look in my head, but a lot of it would be, yeah, I'd definitely be looking for like an artist, but who knows, I might try AI at some point. I haven't looked too much into it, to be honest with you, but I definitely love some art. I'm working on a big map project at the minute, actually, for this world, and I'm developing as well the map, the extra bit of world buildings I'm doing for the sequels. I'm developing the maps for that as well as for the prequel I wrote. That's a very in-depth map targeted on what is now currently Medea. Alright, next question. Do you use generators for character names and places, or do you think of them all individually? When I first started, I did play around with generators a little bit, but to be honest, I was just never happy. So I started doing my own research and building. So I mentioned earlier that one of the things that interested me was how different countries and regions have different names specific to them in our world. And it made no sense not to do that in this world I created. So say for example with Medea, their names are heavily Spanish and Mediterranean inspired, such as people like Santiago, Vasco, Sofia, Maria, the House of Caspin, the House of Reina, things like that. And they've got cities like Gralaga and Velgenos. Mirror names, very angelic, a contrast to their vicious culture. Don't use the letter E, the names like Xavian, Zoran, Silas, Ulrich, Azrael, with cities and fortresses like Israfil and Carlion. Anora use a lot of K and Y in their names. Dane, Galadane, Marcus, things like that. Theron. So many different names like Lucas, Cassandra. The C doesn't exist. C does not exist in their culture. And then, so that's more so with like base names, but I obviously put a lot of names into researching, a lot of research into some names. So say for example, there's a character called Andir Skeva. He's part of the Valkyr, which is seafaring raiders. He was a part of a group called the Arkangarda. So the Valkyr Isles, they're these seafarers, but they've got a small detachment which servers of the Aurelian Emperor. They're his personal bodyguard, and that's called the Arkangarda. And Skeva not only was amongst that, he was their captain, their commander for a while. So Arndir is a combination of Norwegian and Scandinavian for eagle and beast. And you put that together, eagle beast, it's like a griffin. The symbol of the empire is the griffin. And Skeva was a legendary Roman soldier who served Julius Caesar. And then you look at the name Farron. So the main characters Astrid and Eric. So Astrid is a very, very integral character. She's a seafarer who loves adventuring. She's a navigator. She doesn't like fighting, but she's very, very, very smart. Her mind is as sharp as any sword. She was the second character I created for this world, and the first I wrote a full chapter for. So Farron means adventurer or adventurous, which suits her as she's a navigator who loves exploring, and her true love is the sea, the ocean. I'll move on to Sakar Alsara. So Alsara is a combination of desert and hawk in Arabic. Sakar himself is known as a hawk bearer. So he's got this hawk pet, this hawk guy called Sabra, who flies around with him, travels with him everywhere. And he's a desert clansman. So hawk bearer, desert hawk. Larissa is where it is homeworld, and that's like a big, especially the Southlands where he's from, that's very much like a desert. Katara. So for Katara, she is the first character I created ever. She has this weird fighting style. It's based for dueling and for being able to like beat people with movement and with getting around like flowing like water. And this thing is called Takaris, is the form that she uses to fight. It's this style created by the Tariki in the far north. This dueling style, which is not very good for battles, but when everyone's pushed and crushed together, but for duels, it is perfect. So this sword song. So Katara in a few languages, it means string instrument. And Katara, the spelling like you might see in Avatar The Last Airbender, means droplet. So both suit her well. So you look at Takaris, it's a dueling style flowing like water, the sword song. That works, exactly. And like, as Bruce Lee said,
this is what it is, okay? I said, empty your mind. Be formless, shapeless, like water. Now you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Now water can flow, or it can crash. Be water, my friend.
do you use any physical or digital tools to help visualize world building, or is it all just in your head for the most part? So I did play around with sketches early on, and sometimes I still do a touch of stuff on things like Photoshop or even just sketches, drawings, things like that, but most of it's in my head. Like a few things I've put out there. Like I fully designed the symbol of the twins, the sun and moon of Durandale and Azariel. Fully designed that, and I've got photoshopped images of it. I might even get it done as a necklace one day. I'm not too sure, but yeah. So I've done that. I've obviously did the original maps. I did a rough sketch of Katara, a rough sketch of the character Eren as well. But I haven't looked into it a huge amount just yet. But I'd love to. I'd absolutely love to give it more of a crack. I do have a map, one of my original maps, stuck up just above me, in front of me on my PC. So it's about as far as that goes. So this is a very interesting one. So how do the hours compare for these 3 sections? 1, writing. 2, research. 3, treatment / editing / polishing. Where does the bulk of time go? I'd be curious to see rough percentages. So yeah, that's very interesting. I think these days it would probably be like 90% writing, 7% editing, polishing, and 3% research. Editing, polishing might be a bit higher, 10, 15, but honestly, the percentages greatly depend on a few things, I would say. So, do I need to create a whole new culture or not? Like, right now, these last few months, I've been fully fleshing out the Tariki and Idrisu. So I've spent a lot more time researching things, such as Alexander the Great, for example. Bits and pieces like that. So I'll spend a lot more time world building if I need to fully develop a culture like that from the ground up. But most of the time, I'll just be able to write and go through. And then when I've written a chapter, I won't do much editing as I'm writing, unless I see a pretty clear spelling mistake. But then I'll go over it again myself. I'll touch it up a little bit. I might go over it a couple of times, just do a little bit of touching, and then bits and pieces like that. But yeah, definitely the bulk of it is in the writing. So, and because of how much writing I should say I do, it's probably 85% writing, 90% writing, and then the rest would be probably probably more so editing, I would say, than the actual research. So it could be like 7 to 10% editing, polishing, and then 3% research. But that's purely because of how big my books are. If they were half the size and I'd still done the same research, then you'd be looking at a very different graph. Next question: are any of my characters based on people that I know? No. So no characters I've got are based on people I know. Some of them will have the occasional trait of people that I'm friends with, or not necessarily friends with, but no, they might have some traits picked up from them. I've got some very rare quotes here and there that I've heard people say to me, which I really like. So one of them, at one of my old jobs, he said to me on his way out, is that fear is nothing more than forgetting that everything is alright. And I love that. It was stuck in my head for the longest time, and I ended up writing that into the second book. A couple of characters are named for people that I met. One of them is called Compton, who's named for a good friend of mine who owns a bookshop in the town I live. And I hadn't even finished writing Blood of the Eagle, but I was in there most weeks leading up to this, for this 10-month period before I'd even started writing, grabbing a new book for research purposes. And so we started talking, we became good friends, and I hadn't finished, and I asked him if he'd be interested in reading Blood of the Eagle, and he ummed and ahed about it. He wasn't sure, and he told me that he wasn't sure because he doesn't like to read his friends' manuscripts, as he would tell them what he thought of it, like fully the truth. And he eventually agreed to read it, and then he ends up becoming the one who convinced me to publish. And now he's read the first 3 books before, years out from publishing. He's got the prequel now as well, and yeah, that's why he's been just such a big, huge supporter. So I really wanted to honour him in some way. So I've got this character written in who's a bit eccentric like him, and yeah, a bit of fun. Another one called Iris is named after a good friend of mine called Iris, who lives in the Netherlands and who has supported my writing since day one. We actually met through writing, and we've had a lot of stuff in common, like gaming, things like that. So we've done a lot of stuff like that together. We've had big video calls together, big calls, emailed each other, sent each other presents, Christmas, things like that. And so I wrote this character in for her. Irastellione, who we will meet soon enough. But other characters such as Niger and Indra have been named for people that I'm close to, like in that they'll help me come up with these names. Not necessarily named after the people, but they'll help me come up with them. And then the last question is, how did I decide what publication path to pursue? So that's interesting because publishing itself is a very niche sort of thing. I initially did a self-published run of Blood of the Eagle, a small one. I sold about 250 to 300 copies. But one of my big downfalls was marketing, especially when in 2020 when I was doing this small self-published run. I've never really loved social media. Like, I use it mainly if I'm interested in X, Y, or Z. I'll use it to keep updated on news on those. I'll look at it for a tiny bit here and there, and then it's just never interested me. So marketing and posting on that was tough, and figuring out what to do with that. So I couldn't really get far, and I had no knowledge of the field with self-publishing, so it made it a lot harder. And I ended up going, and I was sort of looking around. You submit your manuscripts, but with such a saturated market, it's if you don't have an agent and you don't know 100% how to lay the book out for submission, they won't even get looked at by a lot of publishers, and that made it challenging. And so I ended up going with the hybrid model, which is it's very interesting because it's sort of like all the benefits of, I'd say almost like a happy middle between self-publishing and traditional publishing. So you get your exposure, they do marketing, you can learn the marketing from them, which is something I've really tried to do. And that's sort of where I'm going at the minute. I'm really trying to expand your own personal brand, things like that. And it's been good, so I'm really trying to do more exposure, and yeah, we'll see what publishing happens in the future, but no, I'm content right now. So yeah, that's where I'm at with the publishing. But yeah, so that's it for my first video. So hopefully you got something out of it. If anyone has any questions, feel free to comment them below, and I'll do my best to get back to you. But yeah, stay tuned, and we'll see you all next time.